The moment Sarah's foot broke through the sole of her left boot and touched the rocky ground beneath, she knew she had maybe 2 more days before walking became impossible. The Arizona Territory in 1878 was not a place for the faint of heart, and Sarah Brennan had learned that lesson every day since her father's wagon train had been attacked by bandits 6 weeks ago. She had been the only survivor, left with nothing but the clothes on her back, a single canteen, and boots that had already seen too many miles before the ambush. Now those boots were giving up entirely, just like everything else in her life seemed to have done. She trudged through the narrow mountain pass, her strawberry blonde hair matted with dust and sweat, her once cream-colored dress now a patchwork of brown stains and tears. The town of Silver Creek was supposedly just over the next ridge, according to the prospector who had shared his campfire with her 2 nights back. She had to make it. There was nowhere else to go. Sarah did not notice the man watching her from the tree line above until his shadow fell across her path. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, one hand instinctively reaching for the small knife tucked into her belt. "You're headed the wrong way." The voice was deep, rumbling like distant thunder across the canyon walls. She looked up and had to shield her eyes against the afternoon sun to see him properly. He stood at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sky behind him. His hair was dark brown, hanging past his shoulders in waves that caught the light, and his face was all hard angles and weathered tan skin. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt that did nothing to hide the powerful muscles of his chest and arms. A rifle rested easily in the crook of one massive arm. "I'm headed to Silver Creek," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite her fear. Strangers in the wilderness could mean help or harm, and she had learned not to trust easily. "Silver Creek is east," the man said, pointing in the opposite direction from where she had been walking. "You are going north, another day that way, and you will be in Navajo country with no settlements for 100 miles. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had been so certain, had followed the prospector's directions exactly as he had given them. "He told me over the ridge," she whispered, more to herself than to the stranger. The mountain man descended from his vantage point with surprising grace for someone so large. As he approached, Sarah could see his eyes were a startling shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the desert. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze taking in her condition with a single sweep. His expression did not change, but something flickered in those eyes when they landed on her feet. "How long have you been walking?" he asked. "Men, 6 weeks, give or take," Sarah admitted. There seemed little point in lying. "My father's wagon train was attacked. I'm the only one who made it out." The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My name is Daniel Coltrane. I have a cabin about 3 miles east of here. You can rest there, get water and food. Tomorrow I will take you to Silver Creek." Every instinct Sarah had developed over the past weeks told her to be cautious, but when she looked into Daniel Coltrane's eyes, she saw no deception there, only a kind of steady certainty that made her want to believe him. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "Because you need help," he said simply, as if there could be no other reason necessary. Sarah nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Coltrane. My name is Sarah Brennan." "Can you walk 3 more miles?" Daniel asked, his eyes dropping again to her boots. Sarah looked down as well. The left sole flapped with each step now, barely attached. The right was not much better. "I can manage," she said. Daniel made a sound that might have been agreement or disagreement, she could not tell. He turned and began walking east, adjusting his stride so she could keep pace. Sarah followed, acutely aware of every step, every jolt of pain as rocks pressed through the disintegrating leather. They walked in silence for the first mile. The terrain was rough, all scattered pine and juniper clinging to red rock, with the mountains rising sharp and unforgiving on either side. Daniel moved through it like he was part of the landscape itself, never stumbling, never hesitating. Sarah focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on not slowing him down, on not revealing how much each step hurt. But Daniel noticed anyway. She realized this when he suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "Give me your pack," he said, reaching for the small bundle she carried. "I can carry it," Sarah protested. "I know you can," Daniel said. "Give it to me anyway." There was no command in his tone, no impatience, just that same steady certainty. Sarah handed over her meager possessions, watching as he tucked the bundle under one arm as easily as if it weighed nothing at all. They continued on. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Sarah saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, built solid from hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A creek ran nearby, its water singing over smooth rocks. It was the most beautiful thing Sarah had seen in weeks. "Wait here," Daniel said when they reached the edge of the clearing. He approached the cabin alone, moving with sudden caution, his rifle ready. Sarah watched as he circled the structure, checking for signs of disturbance. Only when he seemed satisfied did he motion for her to approach. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly neat. A large bed occupied one corner, covered with furs and wool blankets. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with cooking implements hanging from iron hooks. Shelves lined another wall, holding supplies and tools. Everything had its place. Everything was clean and well maintained. "Sit," Daniel said, gesturing to the single chair near the table. Sarah sat gratefully, her legs trembling now that she had finally stopped moving. Daniel set down his rifle in her pack, then moved to the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, flames were crackling, pushing back the chill that came with the mountain evening. He filled a pot with water from a barrel near the door and hung it over the fire to heat. Then he rummaged through his supplies, pulling out cornmeal, dried meat, and beans. Sarah watched his hands as he worked. They were huge, scarred, and calloused, but they moved with surprising delicacy as he prepared food. "There is a basin behind the cabin," Daniel said without turning around. "The creek water is clean. You can wash if you want." The thought of cool water on her face and hands was almost overwhelming. Sarah stood, then hesitated. "Is it safe?" "Nothing will bother you while I am here," Daniel said, and something in the absolute confidence of his tone made her believe him. Sarah made her way behind the cabin, finding the basin exactly where he had said. She knelt by the creek and splashed water on her face, scrubbing away weeks of grime. The cold water stung her sunburnt skin, but it felt glorious. She drank deeply, then sat back on her heels, letting herself breathe properly for the first time in what felt like forever. When she returned to the cabin, Daniel had food ready. It was simple fare, but Sarah thought it might be the best meal she had ever eaten. They ate in silence, the crackling fire the only sound. Sarah kept stealing glances at her mysterious host. He ate methodically, his attention seeming to be somewhere far away. "How long have you lived out here?" Sarah asked finally. 5 years, Daniel said. "Came out after the war." That explained the way he moved, the constant awareness. He was a soldier, or had been. Sarah had known enough of them from the wagon train. "Do you ever get lonely?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Sometimes," he said, "but the mountains are good company, better than most people I have known." There was a story there, Sarah thought, but she did not press. She had her own ghosts, her own reasons for understanding why someone might choose solitude. After dinner, Daniel spread out his bedroll near the fire. "You take the bed," he said when Sarah started to protest. "I will be fine here." Too exhausted to argue, Sarah climbed into the bed fully clothed. The furs were soft, the blankets warm, and for the first time since the attack, she felt safe enough to truly sleep. She woke once in the night, disoriented. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Daniel sat by the window, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. Sarah closed her eyes again, comforted by his presence, and drifted back to sleep. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of coffee. Sarah sat up to find Daniel already awake, moving quietly around the cabin. He handed her a tin cup of strong black coffee without a word. She accepted it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm metal. "We should reach Silver Creek by afternoon if we leave soon," Daniel said. "There's a boarding house there run by a woman named Martha Green. She is trustworthy. She will help you figure out what comes next." Sarah nodded, though the thought of what came next filled her with anxiety. She had no money, no family, no prospects. But that was a problem for later. She stood and immediately felt the protest from her feet. The brief rest had allowed her to feel just how damaged they truly were, blistered and cut from weeks of walking in failing boots. She tried not to wince as she put weight on them, but Daniel noticed. Of course he noticed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He walked to a trunk in the corner and pulled out a pair of moccasins. "Wear these," he said, holding them out. They were too large, made for his feet, but Sarah pulled them on gratefully. The soft leather was a blessing after the hard, broken boots. They set out soon after, following a trail that wound through the pine forest and down toward the valley below. The morning was cool and clear, with mist rising from the creek that paralleled their path. Daniel kept the same careful pace as the day before, never rushing, always aware of their surroundings. As they walked, Sarah found herself studying him more openly. Daniel Coltrane was unlike any man she had ever met. He wasted no words, made no unnecessary movements, existed in the world with a kind of complete self-sufficiency that was both intimidating and fascinating. But there was also a gentleness in how he had cared for her, a quiet kindness that he seemed almost embarrassed by. "How did you learn to live like this?" Sarah asked. "Out here on your own?" "Necessity," Daniel said, "and practice. The mountains teach you quick or they kill you." "Were you always alone? After the war, I mean?" Daniel was quiet for so long Sarah thought he would not answer. Then he said, "I had a partner for the first year, another veteran. He decided to go back east, try to reclaim his old life. I stayed." "Why?" "Because there was nothing back east for me anymore." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but Sarah heard the weight of loss behind the words. They walked on. The trail descended steadily, the pine giving way to scrub oak and juniper. In the distance, Sarah could see the beginnings of civilization, thin columns of smoke rising from chimneys, the geometric shapes of buildings interrupting the natural landscape. "That is Silver Creek," Daniel said, pointing. Sarah felt her stomach knot with nervousness. Silver Creek meant people, questions, decisions about a future she could not yet imagine, but it also meant safety, a chance to rebuild. She straightened her shoulders, determined not to show her fear. They were perhaps a mile from town when Daniel stopped abruptly, his hand going to his rifle. Sarah froze, following his gaze. 3 men on horseback were approaching from the south, moving at an easy canter. Even from a distance, something about them made Sarah uneasy. "Get behind me," Daniel said quietly. Sarah moved without argument, positioning herself slightly behind his broad frame. As the riders drew closer, she could see they were rough-looking men, unshaven and trail-worn, with the kind of casual violence in their bearing that she had learned to recognize. The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a scarred face, pulled up short when he saw Daniel. His eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to the mountain man, and his smile was not friendly. "Well now," he drawled. "Daniel Coltrane, fancy meeting you out here." "Burke," Daniel said, his tone flat, "you are a long way from your usual territory." "Just passing through," the man called Burke said. His companions had spread out slightly, flanking them. Sarah's heart began to race. "That's a pretty little thing you have got with you. Where did you find her?" "None of your concern," Daniel said. "Move along." Burke's smile widened. "Now, that's not very friendly. We have been riding all night. Maybe the lady would like to rest with some real men instead of a mountain hermit." "Last chance, Burke," Daniel said, and something in his voice made Sarah shiver. It was the sound of a man who had made promises like this before and kept them. Burke must have heard it too, because his hand drifted toward the gun at his hip. His companions tensed, ready to draw. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Burke seemed to reconsider, his eyes calculating. 3 against 1 were good odds, but Daniel Coltrane stood like a mountain himself, utterly unmovable, and the rifle in his hands was steady as stone. "Another time, maybe," Burke said, though his eyes promised this was not over. He spurred his horse forward, his men following. They gave Daniel and Sarah a wide berth as they passed, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her, assessing, threatening. Daniel did not move until they were well out of sight. Then he let out a slow breath and lowered his rifle slightly. "Are they gone?" Sarah whispered. "For now," Daniel said. "But Burke is not the type to forget a slight. We need to get you to town." They covered the last mile quickly, Daniel's vigilance even more pronounced than before. Silver Creek emerged before them, a collection of wooden buildings lining a single main street. It was larger than Sarah had expected, with a general store, a saloon, a church, and various other establishments that spoke to a community trying to establish permanence in the wilderness. People stared as they walked down the main street. Sarah was acutely aware of how she must look, ragged and dirty, wearing oversized moccasins, walking beside a mountain man who looked like he had stepped out of a legend. But Daniel seemed unbothered by the attention, heading directly for a 2-story building with a sign that read, Green's Boarding House. The woman who answered Daniel's knock was in her 50s, stout and stern-faced with sharp eyes that missed nothing. But when she saw Sarah, those eyes softened immediately. "Daniel Coltrane," she said. "I have not seen you in town for 6 months. Who is this poor child?" "Sarah Brennan," Daniel said. "Her wagon train was attacked. She needs a place to stay, help getting on her feet." Martha Green's expression hardened at the mention of the attack, but she simply nodded and stepped back to let them in. "Of course. Come in, dear. You look half dead on your feet." The interior of the boarding house was warm and welcoming, with lace curtains and polished wood floors. Sarah felt her eyes sting with sudden tears at this evidence of normal life, of civilization and safety. "I will leave you here," Daniel said, already turning toward the door. "Wait," Sarah said, surprised by the panic in her own voice. "Will I see you again?" Daniel paused, his hand on the doorframe. For a moment he did not answer, and Sarah thought she had overstepped. Then he said, "I will check on you. Make sure you're settled." It was not a promise, exactly, but it was something. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. After he left, Martha took charge with brisk efficiency. She drew a bath in a large copper tub, provided clean clothes that had belonged to her daughter, and served hot soup with fresh bread. Sarah submitted to it all gratefully, feeling more human with each passing moment. That evening, sitting by the fire in Martha's comfortable parlor, Sarah finally told her story. Martha listened without interrupting, her weathered hands busy with knitting, her face grave. "You have had a terrible time of it," Martha said when Sarah finished, "but you are safe now. We will figure out what comes next. Do not you worry." "I have no money," Sarah said quietly, "nothing to pay you with." "We will work something out," Martha said firmly. "I can always use help around here. You can earn your keep until you decide what you want to do." It was more kindness than Sarah had any right to expect, and she felt tears spill over despite her attempt to hold them back. Martha simply handed her a handkerchief and let her cry, offering the comfort of presence without demanding explanations. Over the next few days, Sarah began to find her footing in Silver Creek. She helped Martha with the boarding house, cleaning rooms and serving meals to the handful of permanent residents. The work was hard but satisfying, and Martha proved to be both kind and fair. But Sarah found her thoughts returning constantly to Daniel Coltrane. She watched the trail leading out of town, wondering if he would keep his word and visit, wondering why it mattered so much to her whether he did. It was 5 days before she saw him again. She was hanging laundry behind the boarding house when she heard Martha call her name. Sarah hurried around to the front porch to find Daniel standing there, his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable in the civilized setting. "Mr. Coltrane," Sarah said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "You came back?" "Said I would," Daniel replied. His eyes took in her transformation, the clean dress and brushed hair, the healthy color returning to her cheeks. Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "You look better." "I feel better," Sarah said. "Thanks to you and Martha." An awkward silence fell. Daniel shifted his weight, clearly uncertain about what came next. Sarah found his discomfort oddly endearing, this powerful man rendered uncertain by simple social interaction. "Would you like some coffee?" Sarah asked. "Martha just made a fresh pot." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "That would be fine." They sat on the front porch, sipping coffee and watching Silver Creek go about its business. Sarah learned that Daniel came to town about once a month to trade furs and buy supplies. He asked about her plans, and Sarah admitted she had none yet, that she was still trying to process everything that had happened. "There is no rush," Daniel said. "Martha will take care of you." "Everyone here has been so kind," Sarah said. "You especially. I never properly thanked you for saving my life." "You do not need to thank me for being decent," Daniel said, looking uncomfortable again. "Maybe not," Sarah agreed, "but I'm thanking you anyway." Daniel left soon after, but something had shifted between them. Over the following weeks, his visits became more regular. He would find excuses to come to town, always stopping by the boarding house, always seeking out Sarah. They would sit on the porch or walk down the main street, talking about small things, getting to know each other in careful increments. Sarah learned that Daniel had grown up in Pennsylvania, that he had fought for the Union during the war and seen terrible things that still haunted him. He had come west to escape those memories, to find peace in the solitude of the mountains. He loved the wilderness with a fierce passion, spoke of the seasons and the animals and the way the light changed across the peaks with genuine reverence. In turn, Sarah told him about her life before the attack, growing up in Missouri, her mother's death when she was 15, her father's decision to seek a new life in California. She talked about the journey west, the hopes and fears of everyone on the wagon train, the moment the bandits had appeared and her world had shattered. "Do you still want to go to California?" Daniel asked one afternoon as they walked beside Silver Creek, the town's namesake waterway that sparkled in the autumn sun. Sarah considered the question. "I do not know," she admitted. "That was my father's dream, not mine. I think maybe I need to find my own dream now." Daniel nodded, his eyes on the mountains rising in the distance. These mountains have a way of helping you figure out what really matters. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to the mountain man. There was something compelling about his quiet strength, his absolute competence, the way he moved through the world with such certainty. But more than that, there were glimpses of tenderness beneath his rough exterior, moments when his careful consideration for others revealed a deeply caring nature. And Daniel, for his part, seemed equally drawn to Sarah. She noticed how his eyes would seek her out when he arrived in town, how he would relax in her presence in a way he did not with anyone else. He brought her small gifts from the mountains, a perfectly shaped pine cone, a feather from a hawk, once a piece of quartz crystal that caught the light like captured stars. But neither of them spoke of the growing feelings between them. Sarah told herself it was too soon, that she was still healing from her trauma. Daniel seemed content with their friendship, never pushing for more. So they continued their careful dance, drawing closer, but never quite closing the distance. Winter came early to the Arizona mountains that year. By November, snow was already falling in the high country, and Daniel's visits to town became less frequent. Sarah found herself missing him with an intensity that surprised her, watching the northern trail with increasing anxiety as each day passed without his appearance. It was mid-December when Daniel finally arrived, riding a sturdy mountain horse and leading a pack mule loaded with furs. But it was not his presence that caught Sarah's attention. It was what he carried. Slung over the mule were 2 fresh deer, and tied to the saddle was a package wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah rushed out to greet him, relief flooding through her at seeing him safe. "Daniel, we were getting worried. The snow is heavy this year," Daniel agreed, dismounting. "I brought meat for the boarding house, should help Martha feed everyone through the winter." It was such a Daniel thing to do, this quiet generosity that he would never acknowledge as anything special. Sarah helped him unload the deer, which he took to the butcher to be properly dressed. Then he handed her the oilcloth package. "What is this?" Sarah asked. "Open it," Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that made her heart beat faster. Sarah unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a pair of boots, beautiful and new, made from supple leather and lined with soft fur. They were clearly handcrafted, every stitch perfect, made to a woman's proportions. "Daniel," Sarah breathed, running her fingers over the fine leather. "These are beautiful, but I cannot accept—" "Your old boots were falling apart," Daniel interrupted, his tone gruff. "Cannot have you walking around in worn shoes. Winter is coming." "But these must have cost a fortune," Sarah protested. "Did not cost anything," Daniel said. "I made them." Sarah looked up at him, startled. "You made these?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, color rising beneath his tan. "Learned leatherwork from an old trapper years back. I had the measurements from when you wore my moccasins. Just took some time to get them right." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as understanding washed over her. Daniel had not just bought her boots. He had spent hours, probably weeks, carefully crafting them with his own hands. Had thought about her feet, her comfort, her needs, and had poured that consideration into every stitch. "They are perfect," Sarah whispered. "Thank you." "Try them on," Daniel said. "Make sure they fit." Sarah sat right there on the boarding house steps and pulled on the boots. They fit like they had been made for her, because of course they had been. They were warm and comfortable and absolutely perfect. When she stood, Daniel was watching her with an expression she had never seen before, something vulnerable and hopeful and terrified all at once. "Sarah," he said, and her name in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. "I need to say something, and I am not good with words, so just let me get it out." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I have been alone for 5 years," Daniel said. "Told myself I preferred it that way, that I was better off without people. Then you walked into my life, half dead on your feet, and everything changed. You make me want things I thought I had given up on. Make me want to be more than just a man alone in the mountains." "Daniel," Sarah started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I know I am not much. I live in a cabin miles from anywhere. I have got more scars than prospects, and I am better with animals than people. But I care about you, Sarah, more than I have cared about anything in a long time, and I want to know if maybe, possibly, you might feel the same." Sarah felt joy burst through her like sunrise over the mountains. "Of course I feel the same," she said, stepping closer to him. "I have been falling in love with you since the moment you pointed out I was walking the wrong direction." Daniel's face transformed, a smile breaking across his features like dawn. "Really?" "Really," Sarah confirmed. Then, feeling bold, she reached up and touched his bearded cheek. "You are not just much, Daniel Coltrane. You are everything." Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that belied his strength. Sarah wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. This was where she was meant to be, she realized. Not California, not Missouri, but right here in this moment with this man. Daniel pulled back slightly, just enough to look down at her. "I want to do this right," he said. "Court you proper if you will have me." "I will have you," Sarah said, smiling up at him. "Though I should warn you, I'm not very good at being proper." "That makes 2 of us," Daniel said, and then he kissed her. It was Sarah's first kiss, and it was everything she had imagined, and nothing like she had expected all at once. Daniel kissed her like she was precious, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, and Sarah felt herself melting into him, into this moment, into a future she had not dared to imagine. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I've got nothing to offer you but a cabin in the mountains and a hard life," he said quietly. "That sounds perfect to me," Sarah replied. They spent the rest of Daniel's visit together, scandalizing the town gossips by taking long walks unchaperoned and sitting too close on the boarding house porch. Martha just smiled knowingly and made sure they were fed, clearly approving of the match. Before Daniel left to return to his cabin, he and Sarah made plans. He would come back after the new year, and if Sarah was still certain, they would be married. It was a short engagement by conventional standards, but there was nothing conventional about either of them, and Sarah knew her own heart. The weeks until Christmas dragged by with agonizing slowness. Sarah wore her new boots every day, each step a reminder of Daniel's care and skill. She helped Martha prepare for the holiday, trying to keep busy, but her thoughts were always on the mountains, wondering what Daniel was doing, if he was warm enough, if he missed her as much as she missed him. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Sarah attended church services with Martha, sang the familiar carols, and tried to feel festive. But her heart was not in it. She wanted to be with Daniel, celebrating their first Christmas together. She returned to the boarding house after the service to find a familiar horse tied outside. Sarah's heart leapt as she rushed inside, calling Daniel's name. He was in the parlor, covered in snow, looking half frozen but grinning. "Merry Christmas," he said. "You came through the snow," Sarah breathed, throwing her arms around him despite his frozen state. "Could not spend Christmas without you," Daniel said, holding her tight. They spent the day together, a perfect, intimate celebration. Daniel had brought a small pine tree that they decorated with paper chains Sarah made. Martha outdid herself with dinner, roasting a goose and making her famous apple pie. It was the best Christmas Sarah had ever known. That evening, sitting by the fire while Martha diplomatically retreated to her room, Daniel took Sarah's hand. "I cannot wait until after New Year," he said. "Marry me now, tomorrow, as soon as the preacher will do it." "Tomorrow's too long," Sarah agreed, her heart soaring. Let us ask him tonight." They walked through the snow-covered streets to the small church, hand in hand, and knocked on the parsonage door. Reverend Matthews answered, looking surprised to see them. "We want to get married," Daniel announced without preamble. The Reverend blinked, looking between them. "Well, that is wonderful news. When were you thinking?" "Now," Sarah and Daniel said in unison. Reverend Matthews laughed. "It is Christmas evening. Can you not wait until morning at least?" "Morning, then," Daniel agreed. "First thing." They were married the next morning in the small church, with Martha and the Reverend's wife as witnesses. Sarah wore the dress Martha had given her when she first arrived, and Daniel wore his best buckskins, his long hair tied back, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other for as long as they both lived. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Sarah with a passion that made Martha fan herself, and the Reverend coughed politely. Sarah did not care. She was married to the man she loved, and nothing else mattered. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in the room that had been Sarah's since she arrived in Silver Creek. It was not a fancy hotel or a grand estate, but it was perfect. Daniel was gentle and patient, guiding Sarah through her nervousness, showing her with his body what he sometimes struggled to express with words. Afterward, lying wrapped in his arms, Sarah traced the scars on his chest, evidence of battles fought and survived. "Tell me about them," she said softly. Daniel tensed slightly, then relaxed. "That is from Gettysburg," he said, pointing to a puckered scar near his ribs. "Took a bayonet. That one is from Antietam, bullet that went clean through. And this," he touched a long scar across his shoulder, "is from a mountain lion that objected to me being in her territory." "You have survived so much," Sarah whispered. "Had to," Daniel said, pulling her closer. "Had to survive to find you." They stayed in Silver Creek for a week, giving Sarah time to say goodbye to Martha and the friends she had made. Martha cried when they left, hugging Sarah fiercely and making Daniel promise to bring her to visit regularly. The journey to Daniel's cabin took most of a day, traveling through deep snow on trails only Daniel knew. Sarah rode behind him on the horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, feeling safer than she had ever felt in her life. When they finally arrived, Sarah saw the cabin with new eyes. This was not just Daniel's home, it was their home now. She dismounted and walked through the snow to the door, Daniel following with their supplies. Inside, everything was as she remembered, but Daniel had clearly made an effort. There were fresh furs on the bed, shelves cleared for her things, a rocking chair by the fireplace that had not been there before. "I made the chair," Daniel said, sounding uncertain. "Thought you might like it." Sarah turned to him, overwhelmed by this evidence of his preparation, his hope that she would truly become part of his life. "It is perfect," she said. "Everything is perfect." Life in the mountains was hard, just as Daniel had warned. The winter was brutal, with snow piling higher than the cabin windows and temperatures that made stepping outside dangerous. But inside, wrapped in furs in each other's arms, Sarah had never been happier. Daniel taught her how to survive in the wilderness. She learned to shoot his rifle, to track animals through the snow, to identify which plants were edible and which were poisonous. She learned to tan leather and preserve meat, to mend buckskin and start a fire in any weather. But it was not all work. There were quiet evenings by the fire, Daniel reading to her from the few books he owned, his deep voice bringing the words to life. There were mornings waking to find snow had fallen during the night, transforming the world into something magical and new. There were nights of passion and tenderness, learning each other's bodies, building intimacy in 100 small ways. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow retreating inch by stubborn inch. Sarah had never been so grateful to see green things growing, to hear birdsong again after the silent white months. With spring came visitors. Word had spread that Daniel Coltrane had taken a wife, and the scattered mountain men and trappers who were his nearest neighbors came to investigate. Sarah met them all, these rough men who lived on the edges of civilization, and found herself welcomed into their small community. But not all visitors were friendly. It was late April when Sarah saw riders approaching the cabin, 3 of them moving with purpose. Daniel saw them too, his expression darkening. "Burke," he said, reaching for his rifle. "Get inside, Sarah." "I am not leaving you," Sarah said firmly, grabbing the other rifle from above the door. "Sarah, "We're in this together," she interrupted. "For better or worse, remember?" Daniel looked at her, conflict clear on his face, but finally he nodded. "Stay behind me, then." They stood together as Burke and his men rode into the clearing. The outlaw looked even rougher than Sarah remembered, with eyes that held nothing but malice. "Coltrane," Burke called out, "I see you are still playing house with your little toy." "You are trespassing," Daniel said, his voice hard. "Leave now, and there will be no trouble." "But I am looking for trouble," Burke said, dismounting. His men followed suit, spreading out in a practiced formation. "You embarrassed me in front of my men, made me back down. That kind of thing is bad for my reputation." "Your reputation is not my concern," Daniel said. Burke laughed, a harsh sound. "But it should be. See, I have been thinking about this for months, and I decided that the best way to settle things is to take what you care about most. That pretty little wife of yours should do nicely." Sarah felt ice flood through her veins, but before she could react, Daniel moved. He was on Burke in 3 long strides, his rifle swinging like a club. The butt caught Burke in the jaw, sending him sprawling. The other 2 men went for their guns, but Daniel was faster. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, and both men fell, clutching wounded arms. Daniel's rifle swung back to Burke, who was struggling to his feet, blood pouring from his mouth. "Next one goes through your heart," Daniel said, and there was death in his voice. Burke froze, his eyes wide. For the first time, Sarah saw real fear in his expression. "You are going to get on your horses and ride away," Daniel continued. "You are going to spread the word that Sarah Coltrane is under my protection, and anyone who touches her answers to me. You understand?" Burke nodded, scrambling backward. His men were already mounting up, cradling their wounded arms. "And Burke," Daniel added, "if I ever see you near my home or my wife again, I will kill you. That is not a threat. That is a promise." They left quickly, Burke struggling into his saddle and galloping away without a backward glance. Daniel stood watching until they were out of sight, then turned to Sarah. "Are you all right?" he asked. Sarah realized she was shaking, but not from fear, from fury. "He threatened to take me," she said, "to hurt you through me." "I know," Daniel said, pulling her close, "but I would never let that happen. Never." Sarah held on to him, feeling the rapid beat of his heart, the tension still coiling through his muscles. "You would have killed him," she said. "Yes," Daniel admitted, without hesitation. The certainty in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, Sarah found it comforting. This was the reality of their life, she realized. Out here, there was no law but what you made yourself, no protection but strength and determination. "I would have shot him too," Sarah said quietly. Daniel pulled back to look at her, something like pride in his eyes. "I know," he said. "That is why I let you stay." The encounter with Burke left them both shaken, but it also strengthened their bond. They had faced a real threat together and emerged unscathed. Sarah knew now that she could handle whatever the mountain life threw at her. Summer arrived in a riot of wildflowers and sunshine. Sarah planted a garden near the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil. Daniel built her a small greenhouse using salvaged glass, creating a space where she could grow herbs and delicate plants. They fell into a rhythm, their days full of work and their nights full of each other. Sarah had never imagined she could be so happy, so completely content with her life. It was late August when Sarah realized she was pregnant. She'd been feeling ill in the mornings, exhausted by midday, and certain foods that she had always loved suddenly made her nauseous. When she missed her monthly courses for the 2nd time, she knew. She told Daniel that evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply. Daniel went very still. Then he turned to her, his eyes wide. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor," Sarah said. Daniel swept her into his arms, laughing, a sound of pure joy that Sarah had never heard from him before. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though the answer was obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Daniel said. He placed his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "When?" "February, I think," Sarah said. "Maybe March." Daniel's expression turned serious. "We will need to go to Silver Creek before the heavy snows come. I want you near Martha and the doctor when the time comes." Sarah started to protest, then reconsidered. Giving birth in a mountain cabin miles from help was dangerous, she knew that. "All right," she agreed, "but I want to come back here as soon as we can. This is our home." "This is our home," Daniel agreed. They spent the fall preparing for both the baby and the winter. Daniel hunted extensively, building up stores of meat. Sarah preserved everything from her garden, filling jars with vegetables and herbs. Daniel built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and rubbing it with oil until it gleamed. Sarah sewed tiny clothes, marveling at how small they were. In October, they made the journey to Silver Creek. Martha welcomed them with tears and exclamations, immediately taking charge of Sarah's pregnancy with the expertise of someone who had raised 6 children of her own. They spent the winter in town, Daniel chafing at the confinement but refusing to leave Sarah's side. He found work at the livery stable to earn extra money, his skill with horses making him invaluable. Sarah's pregnancy progressed normally, though she grew enormous in a way that made Daniel both worried and fascinated. He would spend hours with his hand on her belly, feeling the baby move, his face full of wonder. In late February, Sarah went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth that lasted through the night and into the next day. Daniel refused to leave, holding Sarah's hand through every contraction, his own face pale with fear and helplessness. But finally, as the sun set on the second day, their son was born. He came into the world screaming, red-faced and furious, with a shock of dark hair just like his father's. "A boy," Martha announced, cleaning the baby and wrapping him in soft blankets. "A fine, healthy boy." Daniel took his son with trembling hands, staring down at the tiny face with an expression of absolute awe. "He is perfect," he whispered. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked, exhausted but glowing. Daniel thought for a moment. "Joseph," he said. "After my father, Joseph Daniel Coltrane." "Hello, Joseph," Sarah said softly, reaching for her son. "Welcome to the world." Motherhood was everything Sarah had expected, and nothing she had prepared for. Joseph was a demanding baby, colicky and fussy, who only seemed truly content when being held. Sarah spent weeks in a haze of exhaustion, surviving on stolen moments of sleep and Martha's steady support. But Daniel was a revelation as a father. This rough mountain man, who could track a deer for miles and kill a man without hesitation, turned into the gentlest of caregivers with his son. He would walk Joseph for hours when the baby could not sleep, singing old songs in his deep voice. He changed diapers without complaint and learned to soothe the baby's cries with a patience that amazed Sarah. They stayed in Silver Creek until Joseph was 3 months old, waiting for the weather to warm enough to risk the journey back to the cabin. When they finally set out in late May, Joseph bundled into a carrier on Sarah's chest. It felt like coming home. The cabin was exactly as they had left it, protected through the winter by Daniel's careful preparation. Sarah walked through it with new eyes, seeing it now as a place to raise their son. Suddenly, it seemed too small, too isolated, too dangerous. Daniel must have seen something of her thoughts on her face because he pulled her close that evening after Joseph was asleep in his cradle. "We can leave," he said quietly. "Move to town if that is what you want. I do not want you to be unhappy here." Sarah considered it. Life in town would be easier, safer, more comfortable. But when she looked around the cabin, she saw their life together, every moment they had shared written into the walls and floors. This was where they had fallen in love, where they had learned to be a family. "I want to stay," Sarah said. "This is our home. But maybe we could expand the cabin, add another room for Joseph." Daniel smiled. "I was already planning it," he admitted. That summer, while Sarah cared for Joseph, Daniel built an addition onto the cabin. He worked from dawn to dusk, cutting logs and fitting them together with practiced skill. Other mountain men came to help, and Sarah fed them all, creating community in their isolated clearing. By autumn, the cabin had 2 rooms, a larger main space and a smaller bedroom for Joseph. It was perfect, exactly what they needed. Life settled into a new rhythm. Joseph grew quickly, becoming a sturdy, happy baby who loved the mountains as much as his parents did. Sarah taught him the names of birds and plants. Daniel carved him toys from wood and showed him how to track animals through the forest. When Joseph was 2, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier. and when their daughter was born in early spring, the birth was quick and uncomplicated. They named her Lily after the wildflowers that grew in profusion around their cabin each summer. She was tiny and delicate, with Sarah's strawberry blonde hair and Daniel's gray-blue eyes. Joseph was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help care for her. Daniel had to constantly remind him to be gentle, not to poke or prod or try to carry her. With two small children, life became even more challenging. But Sarah and Daniel worked together seamlessly, supporting each other through the sleepless nights and demanding days. Their love had only deepened over the years, strengthened by shared trials and joys. When Lily was 6 months old, Sarah was hanging laundry when she saw riders approaching. Her heart jumped with fear, memories of Burke's threat flooding back. But these riders wore badges, and as they drew closer, she recognized the sheriff from Silver Creek. "Mr. and Mrs. Coltrane," the sheriff called out. "May we speak with you?" Daniel emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand, his expression cautious. "Sheriff Baker, what brings you all the way out here?" "Wanted to let you know that Burke and his gang were caught robbing a stagecoach down in New Mexico. They are all dead, shot by a posse. Thought you would want to know you do not have to worry about them anymore." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not even realized she was carrying. Burke had been a shadow in the back of her mind for years, a constant low-level threat. "Thank you for letting us know," Daniel said. After the sheriff left, Daniel pulled Sarah close. "It is over," he said. "That part of our past is finally done." The years flowed by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Joseph grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved to read and could track animals as well as his father by the time he was 8. Lily was wild and fearless, climbing trees and exploring caves despite Sarah's constant worry. When Joseph was 10 and Lily was 8, Sarah gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Matthew and Mark. The cabin expansion became a necessity again, and Daniel built 2 more rooms, creating a proper house. Life with 4 children was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. The older children helped care for the younger ones, and the whole family worked together to maintain their homestead. They raised chickens and goats, expanded the garden, and built a proper barn. Sarah sometimes thought about the terrified, lost girl who had stumbled through the mountains years ago, her boots falling apart, no hope for the future. That girl seemed like someone from another lifetime. Daniel had given her so much more than new boots, though she still had them, carefully preserved in a trunk. He had given her safety and love and a family. He had given her a life worth living, and she had given him something too, she knew. Had brought him back from his self-imposed isolation, had shown him that love and connection were worth the risk of loss. They had built something beautiful together, something that would outlast them both. The children grew, Joseph developing a gift for working with wood like his father, Lily showing talent with healing herbs and medicines, the twins becoming skilled hunters and trackers. Sarah and Daniel watched them with pride, knowing they had raised them to be strong and capable and kind. When Joseph was 18, a young woman from Silver Creek caught his eye. Emily Wilson was the schoolteacher's daughter, smart and pretty and strong-willed. Joseph courted her with the same quiet determination his father had shown with Sarah all those years ago. They were married the following spring, and Daniel helped Joseph build a cabin of his own on the far side of the clearing. Sarah watched her firstborn start his own family with bittersweet joy, proud and sad in equal measure. Lily showed no interest in marriage, preferring to spend her days in the mountains, gathering plants and treating sick animals. She became known throughout the territory as a gifted healer, and people would travel days to seek her help. The twins were inseparable, working together to expand the family's trapping territory. They were 20 now, strong and capable young men who could survive anything the mountains threw at them. Sarah was 45 years old when she realized that her childbearing years were behind her. 4 children, all grown or nearly so, a house full of love and laughter and life. It was more than she had ever dreamed of during those desperate weeks walking through the wilderness. She and Daniel were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. His hair was liberally streaked with gray now, and Sarah knew hers was the same. Lines mapped their faces, evidence of years spent squinting into the sun and laughing together. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Giving up your solitude for all this chaos?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes still that same striking gray-blue despite the years. "Not for a single moment," he said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Coltrane. You and our children, and this life we built together." "Even when the twins decided to see who could eat the most chili peppers and both got sick?" Sarah teased. "Even then," Daniel said, smiling, "though I could have done without the smell." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped together. Sarah looked down at her feet, still in the boots Daniel had made for her all those years ago. She had worn them for special occasions only, preserving them, but they fit as perfectly now as they had that first day. Those boots represented everything about their relationship, she thought. Daniel's quiet care, his attention to detail, his way of showing love through actions rather than words. He had seen a need and filled it without being asked, without expecting thanks or recognition. And she had fallen in love with a man who would make her boots instead of buying them, who would spend hours crafting something beautiful just to ensure she was comfortable and safe. "I love you," Sarah said, the words still as true and necessary as they had been the first time she said them. "I love you too," Daniel replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Always have, always will." Joseph and Emily's first child was born that autumn, a girl they named Sarah. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Sarah felt the circle of life complete itself. She was no longer the lost girl who needed saving, but the matriarch of a family, someone others looked to for wisdom and support. Daniel was a doting grandfather, carving toys and telling stories, showing little Sarah the wonders of the mountain just as he had shown their own children. Watching him with his granddaughter, still so gentle despite his size and strength, Sarah fell in love with him all over again. The years continued to pass. More grandchildren came, from Joseph and Emily, and eventually from Matthew, who married a rancher's daughter. Lily remained unmarried but happy, her cabin always full of people seeking healing. Mark surprised them all by falling in love with a widow from town who had 3 children of her own, instantly making him a stepfather. Sarah and Daniel's house became the heart of a growing family community. On holidays and special occasions, children and grandchildren would gather, filling the rooms with noise and laughter. Sarah would cook enormous meals with help from her daughters-in-law, and Daniel would preside over it all with quiet pride. But Sarah's favorite times were still the quiet evenings, just her and Daniel on the porch, watching the mountains change with the seasons. They would talk about everything and nothing, remembering the past and planning the future, content in each other's presence. When Sarah was 53, she fell seriously ill with pneumonia. For weeks she burned with fever, while Daniel nursed her with the same devotion he had shown throughout their marriage. Lily came and stayed, using all her herbal knowledge to fight the infection. There were times when Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, certain she was dying. But always, Daniel's voice would call her back, steady and sure, refusing to let her go. "You do not get to leave me," he told her once, his voice rough with emotion. "We made a promise, remember? For as long as we both live. I am not ready to be done living with you yet." Sarah fought her way back to health, determined not to break that promise. It took months to fully recover, but by spring she was herself again, if a bit weaker than before. The illness changed her perspective. She realized how precious each day was, how quickly everything could end. She made sure to tell her children and grandchildren that she loved them, to appreciate the beauty around her, to savor each moment with Daniel. Daniel seemed equally affected. He became even more attentive if possible, always making sure Sarah was comfortable, always reaching for her hand. It was as if they were both acutely aware of time passing, of the finite nature of their days together. When Sarah turned 60, the family threw a grand celebration. 3 generations gathered in and around the house, spilling out into the clearing. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and Sarah stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed by gratitude. Daniel found her later, standing alone for a moment, looking at the mountains. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in silence. "Quite a life we have built," Daniel said finally. "Quite a life," Sarah agreed, "and to think it all started because I was walking the wrong direction." Daniel laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest against her back. "Best wrong turn anyone ever made." They grew old together, silver-haired and slower, but no less devoted. Daniel's hands developed arthritis that made trapping difficult, so he focused on woodworking instead, creating beautiful furniture and tools. Sarah's eyesight began to fade, but she could still tend her garden and cook meals that brought the family together. Their children worried about them being so isolated, but Sarah and Daniel refused to move to town. The mountains were their home. The cabin held their entire history together. They would stay until the end, whatever that looked like. Joseph and his family moved into the main house to help care for them, and Sarah delighted in having her son and his family so close. Little Sarah was 10 now, bright and curious, reminding Sarah so much of Lily at that age. One evening, as Sarah and Daniel sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before, Daniel suddenly grew serious. "I need you to promise me something," he said. "Anything," Sarah replied. "When I'm gone," Daniel said, and Sarah started to protest, but he squeezed her hand gently. "When I'm gone, I want you to keep living. Really living, not just existing. Keep working in your garden, keep spending time with the grandchildren, keep finding joy in the world." "Only if you promise me the same," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "I promise," Daniel said, "though I suspect I will go first. Men do not tend to last as long." "Do not say that," Sarah whispered. It is all right," Daniel said gently. "I am not afraid of death, Sarah. I have lived a fuller life than I ever thought possible, all because you stumbled into my world with worn-out boots and a stubborn spirit. Whatever comes next, I am ready for it. But I need to know you will be all right." "I will never be all right without you," Sarah said honestly, "but I will keep living, I promise, for our children and grandchildren, for the life we built together." Daniel pulled her close, and they sat together as the sun set over the mountains they both loved, wrapped in each other and in memories of a lifetime shared. Daniel lived for 5 more years, healthy and active until the very end. He died peacefully in his sleep at 76, with Sarah beside him in the bed they had shared for nearly 50 years. Sarah woke to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. The grief was crushing, a physical pain that Sarah thought might kill her. But she remembered her promise, and she kept living. She stayed in the cabin, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, finding comfort in their love and in the tangible evidence of the life she and Daniel had built. She lived for another 12 years, long enough to see great-grandchildren born, long enough to watch the wilderness around their cabin slowly give way to civilization as more settlers arrived. But the mountains remained unchanged, eternal and beautiful. Sarah died at 88. In the same bed where Daniel had passed, in the cabin that had been their home for over 5 decades. Her last conscious thought was of Daniel, of that first moment when she had looked up to see a mountain man silhouetted against the sky, offering help to a stranger. She was buried next to him on a hillside overlooking the cabin, with a view of the mountains stretching endlessly into the distance. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all came to say goodbye. 3 generations, whose existence was a testament to the love that had started with a simple act of kindness. And in her grave, Sarah wore the boots Daniel had made for her all those years ago, the boots that had been the first evidence of his love, preserved carefully through the decades. They were worn now, softened by time and care, but still beautiful, still a perfect fit. The family kept the cabin for generations, passing it down as a reminder of where they had come from. They told the story of Sarah and Daniel to their children, the tale of how a lost girl and a lonely mountain man had found each other and built something extraordinary. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light turned the mountains gold, those who lived in the cabin swore they could see 2 figures on the porch, sitting together, hands clasped, watching the sunset. The mountain man and his love, together even in death as they had been in life, a testament to the enduring power of kindness, devotion, and love that started with a simple gift of new shoes for a woman who desperately needed them. The legacy they left behind was not measured in wealth or fame, but in the descendants who carried their strength and kindness forward, in the cabin that still stood strong against the elements, and in the love story that became legend. A story of how the smallest acts of care can change everything, how 2 broken people can heal each other, and how love, once found in the wildest of places, can last forever. Their story was proof that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with a single step in the wrong direction, and that the most beautiful destinations are the ones we never planned to reach. Sarah had set out for California and never made it, but she had found something infinitely better in the mountains of Arizona Territory. She had found home, family, purpose, and a love that transcended time itself, and it all began because a mountain man could not stand to see a woman walk in worn shoes, and quietly, without a word said, decided to do something about it.